On this episode of the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, we're going to talk about three major factors that influence camper outcomes. Welcome to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast, where we turn numbers into stories and data into insights. We dive deep into theology and research, paired with practical wisdom and action steps to help camping ministries thrive. I'm your host and producer, Jared Rendell, a camp enthusiast and part of the Sacred Playgrounds team. This podcast features Dr. Jake Sorensen, a scholar, author, practitioner, and the founder of Sacred Playgrounds. Be sure to subscribe, submit a question to us to be featured on the podcast, and click that support button to help make these episodes happen. Find us on Facebook and Instagram at Sacred Playgrounds or at sacredplaygrounds.com. Wonder with us what God might have in store at your Sacred Playground. Welcome to the podcast. Welcome to the playground. Good to be with you, Jake, my friend. How are you?
Doing absolutely wonderful. As we know, fall is my favorite season, and we are getting into the thick of it. So
I've talked about this.
been great.
You're right.
Weather's getting cooler. Football and cross country, all the good things.
Yeah, just coached a football game last night. Tough loss.
Yeah, well,
It's all right. It happens.
you know, when we're coaching the youth in football, it's not about the wins and losses usually, I know that some people like to think
Accurate.
we got to be undefeated, and that makes a great season. And of course, we think about things a little differently in terms of what are we trying to teach these kids? And there's always good opportunity to teach graciousness and sportsmanship and dealing with challenges.
Truth. We probably said this before. I have many times been able to, just within myself, credit my time, especially like counselor, some leadership too with the students, but like things I learned as a camp counselor and how I coach and connect with them right now all the time.
Absolutely.
I think about it regularly.
I think the same thing. I coach flag football, but now I coach middle school track, and same things, just being able to really work with the young people and handle some of the challenges and disappointments. And it really helps keep things in perspective. And those skills that we learn at camp are relevant for all other aspects of life.
And they make a difference for the experience at camp, right? Which is one of the things we're going to talk about today. Here's the plan, everybody. So our plan for the day, like we said, we've got these three. We're doing research all the time. Jake's doing some writing for this, and so we're going to talk about three major factors. And this is sort of a coming together of some different data sets, some different projects that we have that we take these data points and we look at them in multiple directions and see how they connect. And so there are going to be three major factors that influence, that make a difference that affect camper outcomes, which is what we care about, right? We care about these campers' experience. We care about the outcomes, and we want it to last. We want it to affect not just their time at camp, yes, of course, but we want it to last. We want it to last when it goes home. We want it to last when they're back at whatever their other context is, whatever their permanent spaces, as we'll talk about today, is. So we're going to talk about these three major factors that affect camper outcome. That's the plan.
Yeah, I'm excited to dive in.
Before we do that, go. Yeah. We've got good stuff. Let's dive in. We're going to ask our quick camp question, which could be a whole episode, but let's ask that first. Here we go.
Quick camp question.
Our quick camp question for the day. So this came from our post-summer pulse check survey. We got a bunch of great questions, and I can't wait to use them and dive into them. This is kind of a big sort of philosophical one that we'll talk about some now and probably hit on again later. So here was one of them. And this one was in all caps. So
oh no,
this question mattered for them.
They're yelling at us.
They're yelling. I need to know. Here's a question, Jake. So I'm curious about your thoughts. Is outdoor ministry becoming church for many people? And we know what's happening in lots of different, churches and larger church bodies, and the trends and the declines and the all the way back to some of the stuff around the nuns and the duns and all of this. Some of these spaces is Camp One that is becoming church for people. That's the question. Is outdoor ministry becoming church for many people?
Yeah. So awesome question, and it's tough because we can interpret this question in a couple different ways, right? Is it becoming church? Well, how are we defining church? Because of course, camp is church. There's a chapter in my book, Sacred Playgrounds. Camp is church. And it's not that it replaces church, it's that it's part of the church, capital C. And so church isn't the congregation. Church isn't just camp. Church isn't just the home. All of these things together make up church. And so the question, though, it seems like it's asking, is it replacing the local church for some people? The local congregational ministry for some people? I think that's what they're getting at. So, I mean, the first thing I would say would be that, yes, it is for some people, and it has been. I worked with people on summer staff that they would talk about this very thing. Just, I don't feel welcome at the local church, my congregation. This is my church. And, there's a couple ways of looking at that. One, it's like, I'm glad you found a space. And camps are worshiping communities. When you're on a summer staff, we had staff worship every week, and it was a very powerful experience to worship together when the campers weren't there, right? We were a worshiping community. We had communion together, and that was a really important part of what a lot of camps do. But the question of, can it replace the local church? And my answer to that is that it can't, and it really shouldn't. We need other spaces, permanent spaces, where we can connect with the body of Christ and the people of God. Camp is designed as a temporary space, as a temporary community. This is our friend and colleague Rob Ribby talks about this, right? Camp is a temporary space. It's a temporary community, and it's necessarily connected to these permanent spaces. And church is one of those permanent spaces, the local church, the congregation, but also the home. And so, on the one sense, yes, camp is church, but so is home. Home is church too. Camp is church too. That doesn't mean that we can do without gathering in Christian community in the congregation or in the local church in some way, shape, or form. So it can't really replace it. And for those that it is this space that is special, set apart, this is the only place that I can really feel like I'm connecting with God and connect with Christian community. We have an obligation in camping ministry to help these folks find other spaces like that. And we can't accept that camp is the only place for that. We have to help them find other spaces and perhaps create other spaces that can be more like camp.
Yeah, maybe.
And we want our churches to be more like camp, when camp is that authentic, safe space to grow in our faith and find authentic community. We want our churches to be like that. And so we can help influence our churches, but we can't separate ourselves completely from the local church, from congregational ministry. We are necessarily connected, and we really need to stay connected and encourage our young people who are finding camp as the only place that they can find authentic church. We have an obligation to help them find that in other spaces.
Amen. Thanks, Jake. All right, let's dive right in. I know we've got lots to talk about. We've got these three major factors, these three major things that affect camper outcomes. Let's dive in. Tell us number one.
So these factors, I'm gonna say all three of them.
Give it a little context.
I'm gonna say where they come from.
Perfect.
Yeah. So the first major factor is program priorities. The second is quality experience of the camper, and the third is permanent spaces. And so we just kind of talked about that and the importance of these permanent spaces with that quick camp question. But this is an important factor as well in the outcomes of the campers. So program priorities, quality experience, and permanent spaces. So where do these come from? What we're doing with these, diving into these outcomes, is we're looking at the Effective Camp Research Project data. And so we're going back to some of the data that we have from the United Methodist Church. And so the United Methodist Church in 2022, they got together with Sacred Playgrounds and they said, we want to look at United Methodist camping as a whole, not just individual camps, but we want to get together as a cohort and we want to know about United Methodist camping. So what we did was we took a random sample of United Methodist camps. This was the first time that we had ever done this. Usually it was kind of this pay to play opportunity, right? So if you want your individual camp data and camper data, then we will come in and we'll help you evaluate your programs. What this was
Mhm.
a systematic study where we did a random sample of United Methodist camps. And so we have a generalizable representative sample of United Methodist camps across the country. We ended up with 27 camps in our sample. They included small camps and really large camps. And they included all the different variations that there are in United Methodist camping. What that allowed us to do was to have a big picture look at United Methodist camping. And traditionally, what we've done in effective camp is, kind of drill down into individual camps, but then say something as a whole. And so we say things all the time like, camp has these outcomes. Camp has consistent and lasting outcomes on belief, camper faith relevance, the idea that faith matters in my life, self-confidence, leadership, and we develop these understandings based on this large data set and this generalizable understanding that camp makes these differences. The question that we're asking today is, what are the factors that lead some campers to have these positive, lasting outcomes and some campers to not have those outcomes? We know that camp in general, we do camp and we continue to do camp because it consistently has these outcomes. But it's not the same for every camper, and it's not the same at every camp. And so it's important to drill down and say, okay, can we isolate some of these factors that are really key to the camper outcomes and the camper experience? And so that's what we're doing with the data set. And so we've got 27 camps. We've got over 4,000 campers that responded to our surveys. That's first day and last day. And then we had 600 plus that responded to the follow-up survey 2 to 3 months after camp. And we got parent responses from those same camps. And so we have like 1,500 parent responses. And so we've got a huge data set.
Yep.
And we took that data set, and what we were able to do for the first time that we've ever done this is we were able to layer that with our director survey responses. And so we've talked about the Outdoor Ministry Connection director survey before. These directors respond about how their camp is doing, and they also respond about what kind of priorities they have. And we've talked about before that we kind of use those data points to divide Christian camps into 4 camp types. There are camps that are what we would call, nominally Christian, or maybe that faith isn't at the center. So they de-emphasize faith at some camps. These are not common among Christian camps, and they're especially not common in the United Methodist Church. It's only about 6% of United Methodist camps. And so in our sample, we only had 1 camp, and that's about equal to what it is in the United Methodist sample. But the second one is these compartmentalized camps. And this is really important because at compartmentalized camps, they still have, Bible study and worship and all of these things that we would associate with Christian camps. But they don't prioritize things in the same way that they do when faith is integrated into all the programs. And so faith might be kind of alongside all these other priorities, and it might not
Sure.
be the most important thing that they're doing. And they might have a little bit of a connection to congregational ministries, but not a real strong connection. So that's why we kind of say it's compartmentalized. It's separate from some of these other programs and experiences. It's still really present, and you would be able to recognize these as Christian camps, but it's not at the center. The camps that have faith at the center are those faith-integrated camps. The faith-integrated camps have faith at the center of their programming, and it's not just, we're going to do Bible study, then we're going to go do something fun. They incorporate faith into all aspects of camp. And they're talking about faith and Christian practices throughout the day. And they also have a strong connection to congregational ministries and to the specific faith tradition. And so that helps keep the camp experience grounded and not separated from
Sure.
the church and the congregational experience. And so that's what faith integrated camps are. And then if you kind of think of the ones that have a strong faith component but don't have a strong connection to congregational ministries, we would call those disconnected camps. And so that would be the other type of camp. So there's 4 types. There's kind of the nominal, or where faith is de-emphasized, that one. And there's compartmentalized, there's these disconnected ones, and then there's these faith integrated camps. And so what we're able to do with the study that we have now, because we have this representative sample of United Methodist camps, is we can compare the camps that are faith integrated with those that are compartmentalized and say, based on program priorities, are there differences in camper outcomes and camper experiences? And so this is the first time we've been able to do this, and we're really able to do this because of the Rhythms of Faith project and that grant that we received from the Lilly Foundation. So we're able to kind of go back to these data sets, combine the data sets, and really dive in new and interesting ways. And so that's where these three factors that we're talking about today come from.
Awesome. By the way, if you want to see, some of, these projects like this, we've got the findings of a bunch of these things on our research hub, just sacredplaygrounds.com/research. Whether it's some quick data or some articles based on these similar things, or the project findings itself for the different projects that we've worked on. So if you want to go dive in to what Jake's talking about, that's the spot you can do that. We've got a research hub set up there. So, all right, Jake, that's helpful. So that brings us to these three factors. That's what we did with the data, layered it, saw sort of through both, and it brought us to these three key factors.
So the key question that we can answer is, do these program priorities matter, right? Does it matter that this camp, from the director responses, we categorize as faith integrated, and this one we categorize as compartmentalized? Are there actual differences on the ground for the campers? And the answer is overwhelmingly yes, there are. There are key differences. One, we can really see a difference in the faith-centered aspect of camp. Remember, we talked about the 5 fundamentals of camp, and experiencing it as faith-centered is one of those important characteristics of camp. At the faith-integrated camps, the campers are much more likely to experience camp as faith-centered. That makes sense. Than at compartmentalized camps. And so we can see a big difference there. We can also see the big difference in outcomes. And so at the end of camp, campers at faith-integrated camps are significantly more likely to report, I grew in my faith, I learned more about God and faith, I have greater interest in attending church, things like that, compared with compartmentalized camps. Now, it's important to understand that these compartmentalized camps are still Christian camps, and they still have these positive outcomes. And so we're still seeing growth in these faith measurements, and it's still a high percentage of campers that are reporting that they grew in their faith. But it's much higher at the faith integrated camps. And so just to give an example, so at the compartmentalized camps, there are still 79% of the campers report that they were strengthened in their faith. 85% report,
Sure.
I learned more about God. These are still high numbers, right? But the faith integrated camps are much higher. So it's 88% say that they were strengthened in their faith. 91% agree that they learn more about God. And so we can see these differences in impact, right? And we can see the effect size a little bit. It's much more apparent though in the parent survey. And so when we look at the parent survey, we can really see some differences. And remember, the parent survey, these are the parents that are looking back. They're looking at their camper 1, 2, 3 weeks after the camp experience, and they're answering the question, did they grow in their faith? Did they grow in these different outcomes of the camp experience? And the answer is that at faith integrated camps, they identify these things much more frequently.
Okay.
And so, in fact, the effect is so strong that I would suggest, Jared, and I know this is your category usually, but I would suggest that we make this the stat of the week.
Stat of the week. Stat of the week. Stat of the week.
All right, this is our stat of the week. So, what we're gonna do is, Jake will share this with us, but we like to always take the stat of the week, and if it happens to be one of your first times listening, this will be ready for download. This is something you can download, share, or you can hit share on the one on the graphic that we share. as well, because it's interesting and compelling. So, Jake, shoot, tell us.
All right. When faith is at the center of the experience at faith integrated camps, campers are over 2 times more likely to show greater interest in attending church and over 2 times more likely to read their Bible more frequently in the weeks following camp compared with the compartmentalized camps. And so we can really see these effect sizes when we're talking about these individual faith outcomes that the parents are reporting. So we already said, okay, the campers are seeing some of these differences in themselves, like I'm growing in my faith a little more, but the parents saying, my kid is showing greater interest in attending church. My kid is reading their Bible more frequently. And if they're at a faith integrated camp, it's over 2 times more likely to happen than if they're at a compartmentalized camp.
Thanks, Jake. So I know we were kind of doing this in the context because it speaks to this, these initial program priorities. Okay, you may have more to share. Can I let me semi sidebar with a question? It's not really a sidebar because it's right there. So it makes me curious when you talk about all this. I go, okay, so at a camp that is choosing to kind of label itself a Christian camp, why would, well, it's 2 things. One, I am guessing that there are lots of camps, and this is maybe just a check for yourself, camp leaders, that there are plenty who would sort of think they're faith integrated, and yet experientially they're living compartmentalized, right? We hit our Bible study box, right? Maybe we hit our Devos at Night box, or whatever these couple of things are that say, oh great, now we can put Christian on the camp name because we opened our Bible during this chunk, and then everything else happens. So I'm guessing there's a bucket of those folks, and then I'm guessing there's also a bucket of folks who, and this is maybe where I'm curious about, is who are intentionally, and I'm wondering why, they're intentionally sort of keeping compartmentalized in order to not be overly Jesus-y, right? To not be these crazy Jesus people camp, because we think, for some reason, that we're going to get more campers, that we're going to keep campers and not turn them off. We're going to, whatever it might be. And we try to not do too much and try to just stick with the fun, and then insert a little bit of Jesus in there, because we think, I don't know, our camp's going to be bigger, our camper number is going to be better. And I'm guessing, if we take a swath of the data, that we're not, these camps that are maybe on either side of that compartmentalized and integrated line, we wouldn't see a big, oh, all the compartmentalized camps are way bigger, camper numbers are way higher, whatever it might be, versus these faith integrated camps. I'm guessing we're not seeing a difference in that. So
That's correct.
Yeah, right?
Yeah, it's a matter of philosophy, and it's a matter of trying to listen to clientele. And so, camp directors get questions like, how Jesus-y are you? And it can sometimes sound off-putting if they say like super Jesus-y, And so some try to downplay the faith-centered nature of the camp in order to be more welcoming, because we want to be welcoming, right? That's a huge
Sure.
value that we
Of
have
course.
in camping ministry. We want to make sure that other people are feel welcome to come. We want to make sure that unchurched people feel welcome to come. And so the question is, what's the balance there? And how much does that mean that we downplay the faith? And how much does it mean we say, no, we are Christian unapologetically, and because of that, we welcome everybody? And so those become some of the questions. And camp directors are wrestling with this, right? And for some, I think you're right. I think you're right that it's a camper number thing. Can we, are we turning people away and turning people off by being so faith-centered? And that's something that a lot of our directors are wrestling with. And it's important for us to remember that this is the Christian camping industry, and that there are a lot of great camps out there. I work with folks and talk with folks who work with camps that are not Christian and are doing amazing things, right? They're helping build self-confidence and social skills and leadership and all these amazing things that are essential for positive youth development. these kids they have lots of options, right? They can go to some amazing camps out there.
Right.
Christian camps are specialty camps. They are designed around the faith. And so to keep faith at the center is part of what keeps our camp special. And we've talked about this before. But the question that we're really addressing today is these factors that are leading to outcomes. And so the why people are doing this, I don't want to, kind of disparage directors that are making choices for one reason or the other. Today, I'm more interested in talking about these factors. What does it mean? If you have a camp that's more compartmentalized, what does it mean for outcomes? And we can see that in terms of these faith outcomes that parents are reporting and that campers are reporting. Now, again, it's not that compartmentalized camps don't see faith outcomes, right? When we look at the first day survey and the last day survey, and we look at, did they grow? If they're at compartmentalized camps and we take that whole data set, the answer is yes, there's significant growth.
They grow, right.
And the effect is larger at faith integrated camps. So they grow at both, but there's more growth evident and more consistent growth evident at the faith integrated camps. Now, the other variables that we're looking at, things like self-confidence, things like social skills, I know that I can make friends, things like that, those are not significantly different between the two types of camps, right?
Statistically,
so these camps,
yeah,
they're doing great things. The question is, are we building faith? Is that something that is a priority to us? And when it is, then we're more effective at building those very things. All right. So it does matter if faith is at the center or if it's compartmentalized in terms of how many campers are actually growing in their faith.
Yeah. So the short of it is, for us, right? If I'm a camp director, if I'm a board member, if we're having that conversation, the short of it is that if faith growth is at the center of the outcomes that we're interested in, then programmatically, we are going to have greater outcomes, more significant outcomes, if we integrate faith throughout the day in all the things we're doing. That's what the data says.
Yep. And we know that faith matters in the lives of kids, right? It helps them build meaning in their lives. It helps them build strong community. And it helps them make sense of this world. And so some of these outcomes that we're looking at, especially with the United Methodist study, because they had us include a couple outcomes related to service to others and how interested are you in the needs of others and in serving others. And at our faith integrated camps, those outcomes were higher compared with the compartmentalized camps. And so we look at something like that it's really related to faith, but it's not exclusively related to faith, right? Like everybody thinks that caring for others is an important thing. And a lot of camps are trying to promote that, but it's the faith integrated camps that are more successful at doing those specific things than the compartmentalized camps. And I think that's really important to see. And when we look at some of those individual variables, even something like, I am happy about my life and who I am, something like that. It's an identity question, right? But it's also a self-confidence measurement. It's a really important measurement. And we asked this question, first day, last day follow-up. At the faith integrated camps, the campers show significant and lasting growth in that outcome. I am happy about my life and who I am. At the compartmentalized camp, we do not see that significant growth. That's really interesting to think about something like that.
Yeah, those are a couple other variables, a couple other data points that we can statistically tell this makes a difference.
It does make a difference. So, and again, it's about priorities, like you said. So what are we prioritizing? And if we prioritize this, then we know that it matters. And so that's really number one, is that these program priorities, it's a big factor in camper outcomes.
All right, that's number one. Let's move on. What's the second factor that this data is telling us that makes a difference for camper outcomes, lasting, especially camper outcomes?
This one is one we've talked about before, and it's important to reiterate because it's the most important factor, actually, and it's the quality experience. And so we need to make sure that our young people are having a quality experience at camp. And we assess this at Sacred Playgrounds with the 5 fundamentals. And so when camps work with us in the Effective Camp Project, we work to measure the 5 fundamentals of unplugged from home, participatory, relational, faith-centered, and safe space. And we see how are campers experiencing those things at camp. Now, we might look as an outsider and say, oh yeah, this camp is safe. This camp has relational programs, things like that. We're not looking at those things from an outsider's perspective. We're looking at it from the camper's perspective. Are they experiencing it as a safe space? Because if they report that they felt left out or picked on, or they felt like they had to hide their true self, then we have a safe space breakdown, right? And if there's a breakdown in safe space, then we do not see growth, either in faith relevance, belief, or in self-confidence.
Mm-hmm.
And so when there's breakdowns in the camp experience, we do not see camper growth. And this is across the camp types. And so experience always wins out over philosophy. So here's one way we can look at that. So you take a camper and put them at a compartmentalized camp and give them a positive experience at a compartmentalized camp. They might have a faith-centered experience, and they're going to show significant growth in their faith. Much more significant than if you put the same camper at a faith-integrated camp and they have a poor experience.
Mm-hmm.
Then we'll actually see either no growth or a decline. And that's one of the things that's really interesting.
Yeah.
When we see these faith-integrated camps where faith is at the center of their programming and the campers have a poor experience, they associate that with their faith and they'll actually show declines in faith relevance, in the understanding that faith matters in their life, that they have Christian friends, that it's important to connect to a faith community, those sorts of things. And so it's really important to remember those consequences of the experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know, you've brought up, ACA has said that too, just in the broader, that like program quality wins. Program quality is what matters across industries,
absolutely.
within Christian camping and other kinds of camping, that the quality of their experience from the camper perspective is what makes a difference. So that already gives us a few, and and directors, leaders, you're doing this already. You say, all right, so what is it then? What is it that in our context makes the difference for a quality experience or not? Right. And we know those are rooted in those 5 fundamentals. We've got plenty of data now that for Christian camps, those are rooted in those 5 fundamentals. And so getting that kind of checked is really helpful. But of course, for ourselves too, just to go, okay, what are the things then? What have I noticed over my however long of leading this place or other places that make a difference when campers are having good experience or not? What are those levers?
Yep. So always focus on quality experience. We want you to have a good philosophy in terms of faith being at the center of your programming, but you can't do that at the expense of the camper experience.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So there's 2. Program priorities, quality experience. What's the third then factor that makes a difference for these camper outcomes, these lasting camper outcomes?
The third one is permanent spaces. And I talk about permanent spaces mostly because of my colleague Rob Ribby, who's working with us on the Rhythms of Faith project. He talks about camp as temporary community, as temporary space,
Right.
and
Yes. Right.
intentionally connected to these permanent spaces. Some examples of permanent spaces are home, school, church, these spaces that work with and walk with these campers throughout the year. Summer camp is a temporary experience. We can have, touch points and contacts with these campers during the year, but the permanent spaces are home, church, and school. And so those permanent spaces are affecting the camper's self-perception and their understanding of what to expect out of the camp experience. And so they come in with certain expectations based on their experiences. And so here's an example. We ask on the survey, how much do you agree with, regular church worship attendance is important for my faith? All right. If campers are not attending church prior to camp, they're less likely to agree with that. Now you'd think, oh, that gives them a lot of room for growth in that specific variable.
Yeah.
But that's not what we see. If they're not attending church at all, or they're only attending once or twice a year, they do not show growth in regular church attendance is important for my faith. If they're attending, say, almost monthly or monthly or a couple times a month, that's where we see the growth as the result of the camp experience. They come to a greater understanding that regular worship attendance is important for my faith. But if they don't have the basis, if they don't have the core understanding that this is an option, or this is something that might be important, then they're not going to show growth in that. So it's really important that they have these connections to permanent spaces, and that we understand in camping that we're building off of those connections. Does that make sense?
It does. It made me think right away of and I was just pulling it up, the parent handout that we had put together about sort of how to, how to take this how to take this home. What are these things that can, because like you said, we know, if campers aren't coming in with that, well that's hard. And it's not that we don't want to go to these campers that aren't living in these super churchy spaces. Yes, of course, we want to stay connected with those churches. And we know that camps are finding it both necessary from a camper number standpoint and from a philosophy standpoint back to it, that we want to connect with these communities that aren't necessarily. And so to take these campers from here to here, but for part of that outcome to be connecting with home, and like you said earlier, whether it's staff or campers, to be connecting them to permanent space where Jesus is there and important, and integrated into those parts of life, those permanent spaces as well, to connect them with the kinds of places and to equip their home to be the kind of place that Jesus is integrated into all those things. So that next year, the year after, years after that, now we'll see it. Now we'll see that growth, right? Because they started going to church a little more often, or they started reading their Bible, or saying the dinner prayer, or whatever it might be.
I think what we need to remember and humble ourselves a little bit in the camping world is camp doesn't make something out of nothing. That's not what camp does. It's not magic, right? It takes what's already there and helps mold it and shape it. And so we are necessarily working alongside parents, churches, schools and teachers and coaches. We are working alongside what they are already doing in the lives of these young people. And that really means a couple things. One, we need to walk alongside the individual camper. And so this is where it really drills down to the individual level. We can have this philosophy that faith needs to be at the center of all of our programs. On the camper level. There might be a camper there who's not motivated to learn more about God or grow in their faith, not that excited about worship. And if we force them to stand up and clap and be exuberant and things like that, that might actually do more damage and more harm than good. It doesn't mean we're taking away from the faith-centered experience. We're inviting them in and inviting questions. Because if they feel like their voice isn't being heard, or they feel like they're being forced into doing something, that's where we see campers saying, no, I didn't grow in my faith. In fact, I didn't have a great experience. And we see that in the data. And this is what's really important and really interesting. So when we combine these data sets, we're able to suss out little things like this. And those who are not motivated to come to camp to learn about God and grow in their faith. So we asked this at the beginning of camp when they arrive. Why did you come to camp? Was it to meet new friends? Was it to have fun? Was it to experience new things? Was it to grow in your faith, learn more about God? The ones that disagreed with that said, I'm not here really to learn more about God and grow in my faith. If they were at a faith-integrated camp, they actually tended to have less of a positive experience than if they were at a compartmentalized camp. And so understanding that this doesn't mean that we should say, campers that aren't motivated to grow in their faith shouldn't come to faith-integrated camps. This means we have to have a better understanding of the campers that are actually there.
Yeah.
And work with them on an individual
and meet
level.
them where they are.
Meet them where they are. That's exactly right. Here's the other thing that we can do. Another really important thing. We can prep people before they come to camp and really help them understand this is what you're going to experience. So it's not going to be a surprise. The thing is that the vast majority of the young people who come to camp agree at least a little bit that I came to learn about God and grow in my faith. They understand that they're coming to a Christian camp. That might not be their top motivating factor, but they're probably not opposed to it. right? They understand that this is going to be part of the
Yeah,
experience.
they opted in. Yep.
Yes. However, if you're emphasizing all these other things and you're not being honest about faith being integrated into the program, it can feel like a bait and switch. And all of a sudden you're asking me to profess my faith in Jesus? You're asking me to like make this huge leap in my faith when I'm still trying to figure this out. When we try to pressure these campers into these experiences, that's where we might get the pushback. And that's where it feels unsafe. And this is where we would call it a breakdown in safe space. Not a breakdown in faith centered. You're staying faith centered. It's a breakdown in safe space because they don't feel like their questions are being responded to. They don't feel like they can be themselves. Is it a safe space to doubt? Is this Jesus movement and these people within it, are they going to love me even if I don't necessarily agree with all these things?
Mm-hmm.
Are they going to love me in spite of that? They say they're going to, but I've got to feel it. And sometimes we
Right.
get so tied up in the experience of camp. We got 1 week. It can be a life-changing experience. We know that, and we want it to happen. And so we try to force it to happen. And in trying to force it to happen, in making Thursday night or Friday night cry night, and where it feels like it's expected for you to have an emotional response. What if I don't? What if I'm not feeling it? We have to be okay with that. And we have to create spaces that are safe for that. And we need to prep the young people and their families. And so it's not just about follow-up, right? Like we can send them home with, materials to talk about it. We can invite them to connect more in their church, but we can also do a lot of things on the front end of camp. Provide them with materials, not just what to pack, but how to
Mhm.
prepare themselves spiritually and emotionally, and give these things to parents as well. Not all the parents are motivated for their children to grow in faith, right? How can we meet them where they're at? Help them understand this is going to be a faith-centered experience. And your child is going to be safe here and still going to have a positive experience. Really important, right?
Yeah.
So there's things we can do on the front end and on the back end of camp. And how are we communicating things? And how are we being upfront about who we are?
Mhm. Thanks, Jake. Those are these three. I know, like the data, there are layers here and lots that we can connect and unpack. I am grateful for some of the clear actions that some of us can take. Because there's some things coming out, right? To the first point, like clarifying our priorities. We've got mission statements, we've got things that we think about, but clarifying our priorities, our hoped for outcomes, and checking then is particularly around these faith outcomes. Well, the thing that makes a difference is if it's integrated throughout the other experiences throughout the day. So staff training check, program intentionality check, all of that. So I'm going to check all that and say, is this actually integrated? If that is one of our hoped for outcomes, because that clearly makes a difference, right? So there's one. Making sure that we have. We just had an article last week around gathering our own numbers, like whether we worked with somebody like us or did our own program eval or things like that. Not letting those evals sit. We talked about one of those things in that article was if you did end of summer evals with your campers, don't let those sit.
Mhm.
You got to look through those. You got to find themes for those, and those are one way, right? Things you heard from parents. There's all these ways to check on the quality of your experience, like whether you actually did a full, bigger project or whatever it might be. So we got to check our experience. We got to check our program quality and make sure that we are executing what we say we want to do. And then to your point about these permanent spaces, before, during, after, what's our connectivity like? What's our communication and connection like before? And I agree that before point is almost always the one we forget, right? Because we've got all these logistics. We've got to do signups. We've got to, we're in the midst of getting staff. So the most we can do is advertise and process for something like sign up. But there's prep we can do, before, during, and of course connectivity after. So take some of those things, figure out what one or two of those camp leaders might be time to check on for your own. A couple of quick things, Jake. Fill in as it's helpful, because we want to let folks know of some of the stuff that's coming up. Chances to connect. So in just a couple days from when this is coming out, on Thursday the 19th of September, here is we've got a webinar, a Rhythms of Faith focused webinar, right? So this project that we're in the midst of, wondering about how camp can be a catalyst for family faith practices and connecting camp and church and home in a really integrated, to our conversation today, in a really integrated way. So we are basically concluding phase 1 of this project, and we're about to launch phase 2. I'll talk about that again in a second, but we've got a webinar that we're going to share a bunch of the findings that we've got so far. There's going to be more, but the findings that we've got so far from phase 1, particularly around these promising camp strategies, is sort of the main chunk. And we'll talk a little bit too about the site visits that we were doing all this last summer. So that webinar is coming up. 11 Eastern, 10 Central, down, etc. We need you to sign up for that, though, so you make sure you get the link. If you can't make it live, we're going to send the recording after to those that have signed up. So make sure you get signed up for that. We'll drop a link in the show notes. You can find it at rhythmsoffaith.com. It's right there. So that webinar is coming up. We have also opened a request for proposals. We mentioned this quickly last time, but we've opened a request for proposals. The Rhythms of Faith team has for sub-grants for this phase 2 of the project. This is a big deal. This is the next massive chunk of this project, this 3-year experience. And so there are sub-grants for that. There's a bunch of things that are included in that. Lots to learn. Rhythmsoffaith.com. Scroll down a little bit. You'll find that to put in your proposal for a sub-grant. So go find that. Those are a couple big, important Rhythms of Faith things. We're giving this a lot of time and energy. There is also, we've been talking about, to Jake's point, this was kind of effective camp data and some other data from like the OMC Director Survey. We've just refreshed all of our info and built even a couple new web pages and things like that for these projects, these effective camp projects for next year, right? That would be kind of focused on 2025. And so that's all in there, right? sacredplaygrounds.com/effectivecamp or effectivecamp.com. It'll all point you right there. So you can go find all that. Look through that info, consider if your camp would benefit from that. And especially because this is one of the focuses that we're doing, is if you've got a group of camps that are either part of your association, your region, you're connected to certain churches, whatever it might be, this is so valuable in the context of cohorts. And so we've kind of built that into the system, that between some price breaks and some additional data and a special online tool for those cohorts in particular. So you get 6 or more camps together. You do this as a cohort. The price goes down, and you get all this bonus comparative data and things like that. So those we're especially hoping to get some cohorts together of different groups of camps for next summer. All right, there's my fire hose of announcement things. Jake, what else before we close?
Please sign up for Effective Camp and keep using our products, guys. If you like what you hear and you appreciate our ministries, we need your support. And so we've got some products, we've got some services that we would love to help you with. And if you're just listening to this podcast, you can still like it. You can still give a review. You can still tell your friends about it. So please spread the word and help connect more people to these important resources. We are grateful for your partnership and the ministry that you do.
Amen. Grateful to be with you. Thanks for listening to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. Thanks for listening to the Sacred Playgrounds podcast. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/sacredplaygrounds or at Sacred Playgrounds on Instagram. Be sure to hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you're getting this podcast. And if you like this content and it's helpful, you can support the podcast by clicking that support button. Our theme music was written and performed by Taylor Wilson. You can find all his original songs wherever you get your music. Learn more about what we're up to and connect with the team at sacredplaygrounds.com.